You wanted the best. You've got the best podcast. The hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. Chris Voss here from thechrisvossshow.com, thechrisvossshow.com. Hey, we're coming here in a great podcast. We certainly appreciate you guys tuning in. Thanks for being here. We certainly appreciate it. Refer the show to your family, friends, and relatives. Say, have you heard of our Lord and Savior, the Chris Voss Show? No, don't do that. That sounds awful. Don't do that. No knock on people's doors on Saturday morning and hitting them with the, hellfire and damnation of listening to other podcasts. What's going on with all that stuff? Anyway, guys, don't do that. That's all I'm saying. Don't do that. Don't pressure people into joining the Chris Voss Show. Wink, wink. Anyway, guys, like people can see that on the podcast. It's all audio. Anyway, guys, go to youtube.com/Chris Voss. You know the drill. Get your friends to sign up. Hit the bell notification button. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss. Buy my book over there and see all the things we're reading and reviewing. Go over to our big LinkedIn newsletter. That thing's killing it over there in the LinkedIn group. 132,000 people on it over there. A bunch of C-class people that I guess got a buck or two or something. I don't know. Also go to all of us, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, all those crazy places those kids are playing, except for Snapchat for the most obvious of reasons. I don't know why that joke is funny, but I like it. So we're excited to announce my new book is coming out. It's called Beacons of Leadership, Inspiring Lessons of Success in Business and Innovation. It's going to be coming out on October 5th, 2021. And I'm really excited for you to get a chance to read this book. It's filled with a multitude of my insightful stories, lessons, my life, and experiences in leadership and character. I give you some of the secrets from my CEO entrepreneur toolbox that I use to scale my business success, innovate, and build a multitude of companies. I've been a CEO for, 33, 35 years now. We talk about leadership, the importance of leadership, how to become a great leader, and how anyone can become a great leader as well. Or order the book wherever fine books are sold. Anyway, guys, today we have another amazing author on the show. We have some of the most brilliant minds that come on the show, and one of them is never me. Today we have Mark Follman on the show. Follman, and he is the author of the new books, Trigger Points, Inside the Mission to Stop Mass Shootings in America. This is going to be an amazing book coming out April 5th, 2022, which you'll probably see the recording of this. He is a longtime journalist and the national affairs editor for Mother Jones. Since 2012, his various investigations into gun violence and its impact on American society have been honored with numerous awards. His writing and commentary have been featured in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and on National Public Radio, among other media, including now finally ours. Welcome to the show, Mark. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Chris. Good to
Thanks for coming. Did we get the pronunciation of your last name right?
Yes, correct. Mark Follman.
There you go. I sometimes I put so much energy in the show. I'm like, I never know what I say. Like at the end of it, I'm just like, where am I? Who am I? What am I doing? That's one of those shows. So welcome to the show. Congratulations on the new book. Give us your plugs so people can find you on the interwebs, your.com and all that good stuff.
Yeah, the new book is called Trigger Points, Inside the Mission to Stop Mass Shootings in America. It's publishes from HarperCollins on April 5th. You can get it online at hc.com/triggerpoint. You can Google Trigger Points and mass shooting. You can find me on social media, primarily on Twitter at Mark Follman. I'm always happy to get emails and hear from people, and hopefully people will read and get a lot out of this book. I'm real excited about it coming out. I've been working on it for 8 years.
Wow, man. Yeah. Wow. There's a lot of study and research that went into this. This is why I love having the authors on the show, because you guys spend 10,000 hours, billion hours, whatever it is, doing these books, 100,000 hours. And I get to spend an hour just getting all the juicy bits and stuff. So what motivated you want to write the book? What made you go, this is the book that I want to take and write?
Well, I have been reporting on and investigating mass shootings as a problem in our country for a decade now. I really became focused on it back in 2012. After the massacre in the movie theater in Colorado. That was a particularly bad year. Folks may recall that was also the year later that year in December when the Sandy Hook massacre happened. And so I had just been focusing a lot of work on the issue and trying to understand it better. I built a database of mass shootings. At the time, there was very little of that kind of more detailed and analytical information available about the problem. There's a lot more of it now. And in the course of my reporting, I started to learn about this field of prevention work called behavioral threat assessment. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I'd covered gun violence and gun politics for quite a while, and was feeling, I think, the frustration that many people feel about this issue, which is that regardless of where you stand on guns politically, wherever you are on the spectrum, we tend to have the same debates over and over again, and we're kind of stuck, right? Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, this problem just keeps going on, and there's this kind of widespread resignation that, there's nothing we can really do about this, and it's just awful, and everyone gets worked up about it, and then it goes away until it comes back again, right? So I had felt quite frustrated about this myself. And when I started learning about this field of prevention work, I became very riveted to it quickly because I could see the potential in it. And it also was something new. I mean, very few people had written about it or talked about it back then. And so I started investigating it more. And part of it too, for me, was trying to just get my arms more around what this problem is. There's a lot of kind of big myths we have about the mass shootings problem, which I'm sure we'll talk about. For me, it was kind of, wanting to make more sense of it. We talk about mass shootings as these senseless tragedies, right? As if we can't explain them, but they can be explained. And that's really what the book's all about, understanding it better so that we can work to stop them.
Most definitely. And so you go in depth and do you get access to the FBI's behavioral analysis unit, or do you just study it?
Yeah, no, that was part of the work. I, over time, got to know a number of leading practitioners in this field and pioneers of it, and people in different disciplines. So it's essentially a combination or collaboration of work done by people who are in mental health, in psychology and psychiatry, and in law enforcement, and then also working together with community leaders in education and administration and other related areas to, creating teams to address cases of concern or threatening behavior. And so there is a team that does this work and does deep research on this at the FBI, at the Behavioral Analysis Unit. And I was able to spend some time with people there who helped build this program and learn from them about what it's all about and how they do the work.
Yeah. So have they been able to build a profile on people that they can kind of predict might go off?
So no, I mean, this is one of the big myths of mass shootings, is that there's a predictive profile. That doesn't exist. People in this field and in criminology and people who study violence have tried for many years to figure out, is there a character profile of a mass shooter and that would help us identify them, but there just isn't. The fact is that even though there's popular belief that this is like one specific type of person who does this, that's not true at all. There's all kinds of people who commit these attacks. Most of them are male. There are some sort of broad-based contours that we know well. A lot of them are young white males, but there are many others who do this too. And so really what the work is all about is understanding the behavior and the circumstances that lead up to these attacks. And so in the sense of profiling, it's profiling behavior or behavioral patterns and understanding better what the warning signs are that can be identified. And that is very rich territory that this field has really built its work out of. Research on cases going back decades and on many cases that are thwarted attacks, which I learned quite a lot about in the course of reporting for Trigger Points. There are many, many cases that have been stopped. You don't hear about them because, of course, it's not news if there's no violence and nothing happens, but there's good outcomes. But you can look at those cases too and see these behavioral patterns and warning signs. And so that's really the essence of the work.
What are some of the warning signs that they found that predicts this sort of thing or give an indication?
So the way I break this down in the book is in what I have as kind of 8 broad areas of warning signs, and even within those, it's quite broad. So there's no such thing as like a checklist of behaviors or traits that would indicate violence. But that said, there are patterns of things that we see in these cases. So, kind of one of the more obvious ones is expressions of threats, threatening communications, and those can come in different forms. We see a lot of that now on social media, right? Where people will post threatening comment or pictures of guns or things like that sort of suggest what their intentions may be. And sometimes it's direct threats. They may talk about someone they're angry about or how a grievance they have, or it may be more indirect or veiled threats where, I'm like, don't come to school Friday, everybody, because something bad might happen or something big's going to go down. There's a whole range of behavior like that threat assessment looks at. And beyond that, there are other patterns that have to do with, looking for triggering events in people's experience where, if big things have changed in their life that have set them off on a bad path, like, divorce or job loss, financial stress, and then some more sort of common factors too in the realm of mental health, like substance abuse, depression, signs of suicidality are important. There's a lot of interconnection between suicidal and homicidal intentions with this problem. So one of the first things I found in my early database work when I started 10 years ago was that the majority of cases are murder-suicides.
Wow.
More than half of mass shooters commit suicide, either themselves on the scene, or they also, some of them do what's called suicide by cop, where they know they're going to die in a shootout. So that tells you a lot about that risk factor as well.
So maybe they're at a situation where they think life isn't worth it and they decide they're going to kill themselves, but they take their anger at themselves or life, or I guess their anger at everybody, out on everybody first and then themselves. That's a consistent thing. That's kind of interesting. I didn't think about that.
A lot of these cases are wrapped up in a deeply entrenched grievance in a person who is really stuck on something that they're upset, they feel wronged by, and then they may seek revenge or escape through an act of violence, which they had come to see as a valid solution to the problem. I think that's one of the more interesting cultural questions that we face with mass shootings. Why is it that people continue to see this as a solution to their anger or despair? And that's what's going on in a lot of these cases. It's not people who are crazy or insane. That's another one of the big myths. There are very few of these cases where you're talking about people who are suffering from acute psychosis or, hallucinating. That's not what drives this problem by and large.
I think I had heard someone talk, or maybe this is something I came up with on my own, but I think I saw like a commentator years ago talking about it, how sometimes these people, they can't bring themselves, especially in death by cop situations, they're highly depressed and suicidal, but they can't they can't bring themselves to pull the trigger. And so the idea is to go out in a blaze of glory, like, I don't know, the Sundance Kid sort of example or something, I don't know, and, become a rock star and get a name for yourself, but also have somebody else do the suicide for you because you can't do it yourself. I don't know if there's any validation to that at all.
Yeah, there are a number of cases where there were indications of desire to commit suicide where the perpetrator then did not, and perhaps was not able to do that. Yeah. So I think it is plausible that some see suicide by cop as the easier way to do that, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
What are some other ways mass shootings are widely misunderstood? We talked before the show, and some of my perception, it's kind of weird lately where it's really I'm more afraid of white nationalist guys who look like me when I go into a crowd. I'm not afraid of Arabic people or Muslims or anything like that some people I think put way too much fear on. I'm afraid of people who look like me, 50-year-old angry white guys who are white nationalists, because there seems to be a lot of that going on too, on top of the school shootings. But maybe I'm misperceiving that as well.
Yeah, well, certainly in recent years, there has been a rise in political extremism and violent extremism of the nature you're talking about. I've written about that too in my other work as a journalist, and I write about that in Trigger Points as well later in the book, how this is an emerging problem with the threat landscape in our country. And that's actually something also that I think is striking about this field of work. It's very dynamic. It recognizes that every threat case that is being addressed by this work is in some ways unique, right? You're talking about an individual person with a specific set of problems and behaviors going on. And so while there are a lot of patterns that are understood around this, it's also addressing that specific case. And so the field recognizes that it has to adapt to on a case level, but also on a more broad kind of landscape level. So always kind of looking at, in the latest research, at what are the emerging threats in the culture that might be feeding into this problem. And certainly mass shootings, that we've seen more of them driven by far-right white supremacist ideology in recent years. There's the major mass shooting at the Pittsburgh synagogue. There was the one in El Paso, Texas. So that is a rising problem, and the field recognizes the need to adapt to the threats that are happening. But it's at its heart, the work is very much constructive, and that's what really drew me to it. It's I think in some ways a very sort of optimistic approach to this problem, because it kind of meets the problem where it is. I mean, we have a very heavily armed country and a violent culture in some ways, and so the fact that that exists the way that it does, I think, provokes the question, well, what else can we do? What more can we do to deal with this? This problem, as I say at the beginning of Trigger Points, it's the scope of this problem is bigger than its tool of destruction. The debates we have over guns and gun laws, I think, is very important, and I've written about it for many years. But this book, Trigger Points, really tries to move beyond that, to look at this as a problem of human behavior, and what can we learn from the ways people behave about this problem that we can then use to intervene constructively. And there are a lot of cases where that's happening. So that it was very interesting to discover that through the reporting work.
Yeah, that's true. I was surprised by that in your book because, like they don't really report that, hey, we stopped this. I mean, if it's really huge, you might see it on the news, but if it bleeds, it leads. So that's how the news works,
right.
At least on TV. Find out what's going to kill you today by breathing air, that sort of thing. And I don't mean to minimize the news channels, because support people learn stuff, but sometimes it's a bit much.
Well, what you're getting to there actually does relate to this equation as well, because the way that the media sensationalizes, or historically has sensationalized, the problem of mass shootings is relevant to what happens with the field's work and with threat cases. And it's something that I also write about in the book. The way that we consume media now in the digital age has in some ways actually affected this problem directly, because as you were saying earlier, a lot of the people who think about and aspire to commit an attack like this know that they can get and want to get sensational attention, and they do. So the fact that that's going on actually has an impact on some of the people who are doing these crimes.
That's interesting. You're right. I was thinking about, I think it was Parkland, where the news media wouldn't say his name to give him glory. And I think also the Las Vegas shooting. I was in Las Vegas, living in Las Vegas, and someone started texting me and they go, "Are you awake right now?" Because it was about 1 a.m. or midnight or something. And I was like, yeah. And they're like, yeah, there's some stuff going on downtown. I'm like, yeah, it's just Vegas. And they're like, no, you really should get up and see what's going on. And
I remember it well. It was a Sunday night. I
was
watching it unfold. Yeah.
Yeah. One of my good friends in Vegas, she had been in the shooting zone an hour earlier, and she just decided to go home because they were tired, or I don't know, they had something to go do. But she left like an hour earlier, and she had pictures of her right there in the zone, which was just tragic. But I think they didn't announce his name either. And I guess the copycat issue is probably something you talked about in the book as well. These guys see other guys have fame, and I think that guy's motive, correct me if I'm wrong, because you did the research, but I think that guy's motive was to be like the number one worst killer ever or something. I don't know. Wasn't that part of his claim to want of fame?
Yeah, it's in that case, it's actually not clear that was part of his motivation. And that's actually a very interesting case in terms of the research and kind of forensic study of it afterwards, trying to figure out motive. It's one of the more difficult ones. And a lot of people came away from closer looks at that case thinking, there is no motive that we can describe here clearly. And that does happen with a lot of these cases. But the quest for sensational attention and the desire to outdo predecessors, previous attackers, is very real and exists in a lot of cases. But there has also been a shift, as you're pointing to, in the way that the media handles this now. That's something that has happened in recent years that is progress, in my view. And I've written about this quite a bit, and I do in the book as well, that this is an important kind of balancing act that we need to take on in the media, but also as a society in general, because people share this stuff on social media and online, and it spreads like wildfire. So you can think back 5-10 years ago to major mass shootings, and we would see the face of the perpetrator all over television, all over the internet. We would see the videos, we would read the manifestos, the so-called manifestos they'd post with their grievances and their rants. That happens less now, because I think the media has come to understand, and people have come to understand more widely, that can actually have an ill effect. And it does. I write about it in the book. There's some very specific ways that this is contributing to the problem.
Yeah. I think if I remember rightly, one of his guns jams, or two of his guns jammed. And if it hadn't been for the jams, he would have killed a lot more people in the Vegas shoot. I'm just going from memory on that. So somebody will have to validate that. But yeah, it's I think that's good. You bring up the thing where a lot of times, and I shouldn't say a lot because I don't know that for a fact, but many times I've seen where there's some pretty good indications on social media that they're going to go off. Like they'll post their gun or say, I'm going to go do something. And just the most shameful thing you'll see is their friends making comments like, yeah, go get them, or, just encouraging stuff when really, if I saw that, I'd be like 911. Is there something that you found in the profiling and all the studies that they've done where the family or the friends around the people usually are aware that this person has problems? Like there's a lot of these kids that had problems. The Sandy Hook kid had a lot of problems, and they decide, well, give him a gun and we'll teach him gunfire. That's always a good way to fix somebody who has mental health problems. At least that's, like I say, correct me where I'm wrong here. But the kid recently that was in Detroit.
Near Detroit, yeah.
Yeah. The parents, they're going through a mess. He's going through a mess. And like, give the kid a gun,
right.
And all these different indications where the family, in fact, I was really glad to see the parents charged. I've been saying for 2 decades, parents need to be charged in these things. If you build a monster, you should go to jail with your monster. And that has to be, I guess there has to be a fine line of proving that you built the monster. But I mean, reckless stuff like that's just insane to me. I don't know. You tell me your thoughts on research.
Yeah, I mean, the Oxford high school case in Michigan last fall is a stark one in terms of the circumstances that led up to that attack. I try to be careful about judgment, in the court of public opinion. People will develop opinions quickly based on what they see in the news. And I think, obviously our system says everyone deserves their day in court and gets, proper justice proceedings and all that. That said, there are some aspects of that case that we know already. And I'm actually I have a story coming out about the Oxford case soon around the time of the book. It's clear that there were some very stark circumstances there where this was a kid who was demonstrating some very concerning behaviors. People were worried around him at school, teachers, students. The parents, there seem to be some real issues there with the family relationships and what's going on in the home. But the fact that they got the kid a gun and then didn't respond to concerns from the school, there are not many cases like that I can recall. And I've researched a lot of cases. So, that being said, I think to your broader question, there are... In all of these cases, there are warning signs. There's a range of what that is and how detectable they are. And it's very important for people to understand that, and leaders in the field of threat assessment will say this, be the first to say this. It's always easier to see this in hindsight, to see what the warning signs were. And that's really the heart of this work, is training people who know what to recognize, and then beyond that, creating a broader community and cultural awareness of what these warning signs are, so that people speak up when they have concern. Because there were people around the kid in Michigan who were very worried. There were kids who were skipping school. They were so worried about what he was doing on social media. But had there been a proper threat assessment process there, that people examining that threat would have looked at his social media activity. The school has said since that tragedy that they had no awareness of his social media activity before the attack.
Wow.
So there is a lot more that we can do to recognize this as it's coming. It's this is one of the real innovations of this field going back decades, is to see that there is a often detectable, discernible pattern of behavior that leads up to these.
Yeah. Is that something that, my mom was a teacher for 20 years. I drove, in fact, I think Thursday. Yeah, Thursday. It's been one of those weeks. South by Southwest was this week. So I drove by an elementary school on my way to the store, and I remember seeing a cop there. And I thought, it's really a shame that we've come to this in this country, that, you have to have cops parked at the schools. So do schools have to have access to, schools can't. How much more do we need schools to do? We're just trying to educate people here, and they have to have threat assessment. I grew up, and you start the book way back when with John Lennon's assassination, or at least your research, in 1980. I grew up and graduated high school in 86. And I lived up in American Fork, Utah, which is a very rural community. If you saw the movie Footloose, the original one with Bacon in it, that's where it was filmed. And so everybody's got a pickup truck with a gun rack in the back with a loaded gun in the rack just in case you find a deer, because there's, deer walking around all the time. And so I would go out. I remember walking out of my school doors, and you would see all the pickup trucks with all the gun racks with a gun in them. We never had any school shootings. No, we didn't even have to ban them. There was no laws saying you can't bring guns on school property. What happened to our country over the arc of this thing? Is there any research on that as to what's going on?
Yeah, well, I found in my research over the years on this that this problem has grown. It has escalated in some ways, both in frequency and in scope and in lethality. There were school shootings and mass shootings going back into that era and even earlier, going back to the 60s and 70s. But I think part of the issue is that we see and know about it a lot more now because of the world we live in. Yeah. That has its own kind of exacerbating effect, as I talk about in the book. But I did become very interested in the broader question I think you're getting at, which is what are the kind of like cultural forces and historical forces that are behind this problem? And there's no easy answer to that. But I think it's one of the things that I find so compelling about this prevention method is that in a certain way, it doesn't need to answer those questions because it's taking a more practical approach to solving the problem. It's saying, what can we recognize about this behavior? What are the patterns we can find? And then how do we work to intervene constructively? So it's not prediction, it's prevention. It's not punitive, it's constructive when it can be. It's not always that way. There are cases where people who are behaving in threatening or dangerous ways need to be prosecuted. But that's not the central goal of the work. The central goal of the work is to try to, it's really a twin goal. It is to head off violence perceived to be a danger at the same time as giving help to people who clearly need help. And that's true in almost all of these cases. You're talking about people with serious circumstantial, behavioral, and mental health problems.
The question I had for you, I'm popping between 2 or 3 different questions in my head. Is this a USA problem? Or is this not a USA problem?
It is a human problem and it's a global problem. These kinds of attacks happen in other places too. However, it is inordinately an American problem, which is to say we have this a lot more here than most other societies that are comparable to American society, a wealthy, first world Western nation, if you will. And there are other societies like ours in other ways of comparison that don't have nearly the frequency or depth of this problem.
What if schools had, and I don't know, maybe schools already do this, but schools had like a parent teacher night where they get all the parents, hey, if you want to send your kid to school, they've got to come to a big meeting on shooting prevention and signs to look out for if your kid is starting to go off the rail. You'd mentioned it earlier, sometimes the kids know that the kid's going to go off the rails. I think the Parkland shooter, like they knew that guy was going to go, if I recall rightly. I think they were worried about the kids in Littleton, if I recall rightly. But sometimes the kids know, and that's kind of a really interesting indicator.
Absolutely, and that there are many cases where that's true. Where this gets tricky, and I think is really important to distinguish is that while ordinary people who aren't trained in the warning signs or trained in threat assessment wouldn't necessarily know what to recognize, people do have instincts about their concerns, right? You see someone acting in ways that makes you feel worried or anxious. And the way that this prevention method works, this approach is essentially tries to cultivate awareness in the community and broadly that if you're feeling that way, if you're worried, reach out for help, speak up. It's really very similar to the notion of see something, say something that became like a national mantra after 9/11, right? That, if we're worried about future attacks, whether it's terrorism or a school shooting, if you have something you're concerned about, reach out for help. And at that point, having a team of people in place who know how to do this work, who are trusted in the community to handle it, because it's nuanced and it's delicate in some ways. On the one hand, you want people to speak out and you want to be transparent about what's going on, but on the other hand, you don't want to stigmatize people who are acting in ways that make others uncomfortable, but maybe it's benign, maybe they're not a threat. And so there's kind of a careful process there where, a team that does this work well mental health professionals, law enforcement professionals, school psychologists, HR directors in a corporation know to come together professionally, look at a situation and think about, what's the best way we can intervene. We can talk to this person, find out what's going on with them, see if we can help them with what they're aggrieved about, and so on and so forth. So by taking that approach, it's really trying to dissolve or de-escalate the potential for violence. And if you have someone who's thinking about violence or planning violence, going down this, what they call in the field, the pathway to violence, that's a series of escalations, right? So in a school setting, when kids are feeling worried about another kid who says something on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, that in and of itself doesn't necessarily tell you anything about whether or not that kid's a threat. Lots of kids make dumb comments and mouth off. You need people looking at this who have the training and understanding once it's been shared with them by others who are concerned, right? That's really sort of the basic description of how this model works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I'm usually watching for the person who's dejected, who seems alienated, who seems like they're cooking on something. I don't know. I don't even know if that's the correct response, but that's what I go with. I mean, when I'm watching crowds and stuff, like I say, when I go to crowds, I'm looking for old white guys who look like me, who are fat, angry, and white nationalists. I don't even know if that's the appropriate thing to do. Let me ask you about the schools have done a thing, and I'm not trying to shame them by saying this, but this thing that they have where, if a kid, makes a sign of a gun or draw something funny. I think there's been some really kind of egregious stuff or not egregious, but really kind of outside the realm of reality where, I don't know, some guy had like a licorice that he was holding that looked like he was pointing a gun or something, so something that you just claim, I'm not sure you really crossed the threshold there, but I understand the need to protect. Has that been effective, or has that kind of gone too far sometimes? I don't know.
Well, I think I understand the example you're drawing. I've seen some things like that come out in local news reporting. I remember a case like that in Florida not too long ago. That's really not what this approach is, in the sense that like that's just sort of a sounds like a knee-jerk sort of punitive reaction, right? Like really crack down, like kick a kid out of school, throw someone in jail. But that's not effective. I mean, if you look at, there's a long case history also with mass shootings where those kinds of punitive sort of Band-Aid measures were taken, but then the person comes back and commits an attack. So that's not to say that aberrant behavior shouldn't be dealt with or punished, but if you're looking for a more broad-based understanding of a threat and then a more kind of long-term and effective solution, you have to go beyond that. It's not just a person waving a gun signal or posting a threat online. You have to look at the full picture. And what you were saying earlier about like the kinds of people you might look for in a crowd. One of the things that I found really fascinating when I was researching the original development of this field, it goes back decades. There were mental health professionals were starting to collaborate with Secret Service agents to try to stop assassinations, right? They were trying to figure out what else can we do to identify potential assassins in a crowd. And what they found was, in studying assassins who had been locked up, was that these were not those stereotypical figures that you described, like the really weird guy muttering under his breath with a trench coat at the edge of the crowd.
Wait, that's me. No, I'm just kidding.
These were actually much more normal people. It's much more banal than that. That these were people who, inside were angry or had grievances, and they had psychological issues. They had mental health problems. Nobody would look at someone like that and say, this person is mentally healthy. But they were not insane, and they were not, someone who would stand out in a way that you would imagine, like from the movies. And so that was an early clue in the development of this field, that really what we're talking about here is not trying to define a predictive character profile of a killer. That doesn't exist. What we're trying to find is the set of behaviors we can recognize that lead up to this.
All right. Well, when I go to the fair, I'm going to have to just have everyone go through a metal detector to get near me or something. I don't know. Maybe. But no, it's an interesting thing. And I think this is insightful. I think you bust a lot of myths and stuff. Is there, this reminds me of a few people have written me and said, the Second Amendment is more important than the Constitution, which I don't think they understand how the two of them work together, the stack. You can't have one without the other. But did you find any basis to this thing that people say, well, if teachers had guns, or if everyone had guns, that they could stop these shooters?
Well, there's that is something that I've looked into quite a lot. I do say at the outset of Trigger Points that the book isn't really about guns or gun laws, that, I'm focused on this prevention method and human behavior. But of course, guns are inextricable to the problem. And that is something that comes up in the context of this field's trainings and outreach. In fact, I tell the story of this specifically in the book about that coming up. And there are a few mass shooting survivors who have become engaged with this field and spreading threat assessment nationally. One of them is a really impressive woman who was in Virginia Tech. She was shot 3 times, survived, and is now part of promoting the work of response and recovery and prevention for the field. And she told me one of the times that we were talking that she had, will have people come up to her after she talks about her experience at a training or a seminar, and she'll get asked that question, the good guy with the gun question, right? What if, a student or a teacher had a gun? That all would have ended in a second. It's just not the reality of how these play out. Talks about, how it happens so fast that, no one has time to react that way. You would have the danger of someone shooting, have a shootout in a classroom. I mean, you can imagine
your background. Yeah.
And there's really no evidence through case examples that would work. There have been a few cases over the years where somebody with a gun who's a civilian steps in and disrupts a shooting, but there are very few of them. There are also some that have gone wrong.
Yeah.
So,
I think usually they're police officers, aren't they?
Sometimes they're off-duty police officers or military people who have gun training, extensive training. But there's no scientific proof that would be effective at stopping these.
I remember that was big during was it the Pure nightclub in Florida?
Pulse nightclub.
Pulse nightclub, where I had a bunch of gun friends at the time that I was still friends with on Facebook that were like, if everyone just would have pulled a gun and shot the guy, and you're like, you're in a dance club. Do you understand? You can't just fire a weapon. You've got your background where there's people in the foreground, the crossfire in the background. Yeah. You can't just open fire in a 30 by 30 crowd of 100 people and not expect, you might end up killing more people that way than the other way. Right. But it's kind of interesting.
And really what my book is all about is, what if we just never had someone open fire in the club in the first place? Yeah. That's what we're striving for. We're trying to figure out who that guy is before he comes in and starts shooting everybody.
Without getting the politics of it, then what about access to guns? Was there any research that found that a majority of these guys got access to guns? What was the thing that they always talk about where they go, there should be more of a delay when you ask for a gun, background checks and delays. I think there were some failures of the FBI on a couple of them. Would that have been a factor at all in your research of lessening them, or is that not a factor?
Oh, I think it's certainly a factor. Look, what the field of threat assessment does, I think, from my perspective, in taking on this issue is contend with the reality, meets the reality where it is, right? Mm-hmm. We have roughly 400 million firearms in the United States. They're easy to get in many places. So that's just the fact that we live with, right? Now, if you had a harder time for people who were disturbed, angry, and planning to go out and shoot up a nightclub, a movie theater, or a school, if it was harder for them to get a gun, sure, that would help. But we need a lot more than that, right? Because that's just not the reality. I do take on gun laws in some very specific ways in the book, in my research, in the ways in which they intersect with this work. So one example would be a newer type of statute that we have that's started to spread in multiple states they're referred to as red flag laws. I don't know if you're familiar with this. They're also called extreme risk protection orders. This is essentially a civil mechanism where a family who's concerned about a loved one or a friend could go to a court and petition the court to remove firearms, or to bar them from having firearms for a temporary period of time because they think they're a danger to themselves or others. And a judge decides that, right? That's an important tool in a threat case where you've got someone who you have evidence is planning to commit suicide, is talking about targeting kids at school they hate and wants to kill, or coworkers. So there's some specific tools like that within the realm of firearm regulation that I think are very important and growing with respect to threat assessment work and background checks as well. I mean, certainly, people who are having a hard time and moving down a pathway, making threats and maybe planning violence, if you had more stringent background checks for somebody who's not doing well, that may be helpful if they qualify under that regulation because they have some kind of criminal record or, involuntary mental health commitment in some states. The problem there is that a lot of these cases, you don't have records like that in the perpetrators.
Wow.
So that's not going to necessarily stop them either.
Yeah. It's a complex issue, and I'm glad you've gone in depth with it because, busting some of the myths. I mean, I had a lot of myths that I'm just like, oh, I thought that was a thing, but maybe it's not. It definitely is a much wider and broader complex problem than we understand, and I guess we just have to research it more and more and maybe get better at these things or something.
Yeah. Well, I think it's happening at least through the work of this field, which has been growing, and that's for me is real part of the excitement of the book. I think that Trigger Points has the potential to change the way people think about this problem. We recycle a lot of the myths in the media and on social media over and over that everyone who does this is insane and they just snapped and came out of nowhere. None of that's true. Most of the people who do this are making rational plans. They're planning out what they're doing and then doing it. And, we can look back at it and say, well, it's not rational to shoot up a school or a movie theater, but to them, they were convinced of what they were doing as valid. It was something they needed or wanted to do to end their rage or suffering or sadness or despair or to find a way out of whatever predicament they were in, and then planned out how to do it very methodically. And so if we don't recognize the reality of that, we're not really, as well equipped to deal with the problem, to keep a gun away from that person or to prevent them from going and using it, right?
Yeah.
It's not necessarily easy to detect these things, but they are detectable through this method. And I think that the fact that this is becoming more known and that more places are doing this, from schools to corporations to the government and government agencies, is promising. There are actually about a half dozen states now that mandate threat assessment programs in their public schools. And that's a recent development. So hopefully, more of these cases will be caught before it's too late.
Yeah, hopefully they will. I think I believe that, and this is my opinion, but I've been saying for 20 years, if you raise a monster and we can show that you did a shitty job being a parent, you should go to jail with your kid. There's a certain age or something. I don't know. You have to figure all that out. And it's not my job to.
It's hard though, right? I mean, it's a slippery slope. Who's a bad parent? I mean,
who's a bad parent? Who's not? Because I mean, all parents are phoning it in. But I think the Michigan thing with the parents that got prosecuted, I think that sends a good warning shot across the bow. Stuff like that, prosecuting the parents, sends a message to people that, hey, maybe we want to pay a little bit more attention to what's going on with the kid. I don't know. That's just my opinion. But what do I know?
Well, I would at the least agree that as I said earlier, the circumstances of that case and the apparent role of the parents is very stark. And I think that what you're suggesting seems to be in the thinking of the prosecutors there, that this is a case that they need to show that through a court of law, and we'll see if it happens. If they're convicted of manslaughter, that's unprecedented. So we'll have to see.
The mother of the Sandy Hook shoot, that kid had problems. The father was alienated. The mother was a single mother trying to hold it together. That kid had problems, and she knew he had problems, and she knew he was getting worse. The stuff he was doing in his room, where I think he was folding up the windows and doing all sorts of weird stuff. If I recall rightly, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember reading kind of in depth of what was going on with that kid. That was like the wrong trajectory to take him down. Of course, we can't prosecute her because he killed her, but I don't know, man. Somewhere there needs to be.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I think it's very, very hard to judge how a parent would handle having a child like that, right? It's just, it's so complicated and difficult. And one thing that I have seen in a lot of cases that I've researched, that case and others, that the emotional denial in a parent is very powerful. It's very hard for a parent to see their own child as a dangerous threat, or what we would consider, a monster, right? In this kind of lay cultural sense. And that's happened in many other cases. There's a case in Oregon in 1998 at a high school where the mass shooter there, his father bought him a gun. It was part of the hunting culture in Oregon. And he thought, I think, essentially he could mollify his son's interest and troubles by engaging him in that interest, right? Mm-hmm. Well, in hindsight, if you look at the behavioral warning signs, that was not a good thing to do. But that's a harder thing for a parent to see in that situation. Look at Columbine. The parents of those kids, to this day say that they couldn't see it. And one of the shooter's mother, Dylan Klebold's mother, Sue, went on to do suicide prevention work for 20 years and wrote a book about her experience, and became very persuaded of the inability of a parent to recognize that in a child of their own. So I think it's important to recognize that that's tough. I'm not saying that those behaviors are justified. I think you're
right. I didn't think about the aspect of, when you're a parent, you have an endearment towards your child. I know that sometimes families have known there's something wrong, a kid that's schizoid or whatever, and sometimes our mental health facilities or the ability to have them. I know a lot of them were destroyed under Reagan. When I was a kid, if somebody was a wacko, you sent them down to the Utah County Health Clinic and they locked them up for a week and did whatever they did to them. And I think some of the shooters, or at least one story I'm remembering, the parents were really concerned and they couldn't keep him in a facility or something. I don't know. Wasn't that also the Ronald Reagan shooter problem? Wasn't he schizoid?
Well, it's really interesting that you bring that up. The guy, the assassin who attacked Ronald Reagan, I don't know if he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, but he had serious mental health problems. He was locked up under that premise and had an insanity defense. But you're pointing to that reminds me too that I write about in the book the very genesis of this field came about through forensic psychologists going into state mental hospital and studying people who were thought to be criminally insane in the 1970s, and kind of all just thrown into this place and locked up and throw away the key. But the people who then did this work and went and investigated to try to understand better what were the thought processes and behaviors leading them to what they did, and what were their life circumstances, and do they have clinical mental illness, and asking all those questions and getting to understand at a much deeper level people who have problems and risk like that, did a lot toward developing this model, right? That's not a good solution either. There's a reason why we had that era of deinstitutionalization in the country where, the country sort of realized in that period that, locking everybody up who we think is crazy or dangerous isn't really a good policy either, right?
Yeah, I would have been one of the first ones. Well, this has been really insightful. I mean, as you've heard, I have a lot of myths and a lot of things that I don't understand quite a bit, and I think a lot of people do, and hopefully people have seen that. And so that's the more important to read your book and understand it. The one thing man can learn from his history, I always say, is that man never learns from his history. So we need to try and learn from our history and how things work so that we won't repeat them. And hopefully we'll be able to put the nail on the head this one of these days and stop all this.
Yeah, well, I hope that one thing that the book does is, or includes, is I tell a number of stories of cases in depth, of cases where this has been prevented. And I hope through that storytelling that people will be able to see and understand this process really well, because it's one thing to sort of explain how it works. And we've done some time doing that in this discussion, but it's another to actually see it in a specific case. And gaining access to that took me quite a bit of time. But once I was able to do that, I found it just really illuminating to see, some of these warning signs that we talk about, and then see how an experienced team handled them, how they addressed it and worked with a case over a period of weeks and months to try to help somebody onto a better path, to get them away from thinking about violent behavior, and in a number of cases doing it quite successfully. And again, you don't hear about these because they never make the news, and that's what you want. Yeah. Somebody doing well does not make the news. But in telling those stories, I hope that people will see that there is a way we can deal with this problem that isn't just about arguing over gun control. That's an important argument. We're going to continue to have that debate and hopefully progress on those policies. But we also need to do more to address how we handle mental health and how we do community-based work to try to handle this problem before it happens. We're so caught up in reactive response to this now, right? Active shooter drills everywhere, and cops in schools, as you said earlier, and arming people, and doing surveillance of social media. None of those things are going to prevent attacks in the way that addressing this more holistically up front will. That's what I've come to believe through the work of this book, and I hope people will see that. If I can change people's understanding in that way, then I'll be really, really gratified with the work of the book.
Most definitely. Well, thank you very much, Mark, for coming on the show. We really appreciate it, man. Great discussion.
My pleasure. Great to talk with you, Chris.
Thank you. Give us your plugs where people can find you on the interwebs and learn more about you.
Yeah, so the book again is called Trigger Points inside the mission to stop mass shootings in America. I am actively on social media myself, primarily on Twitter at Mark Follman. I'm also an editor from Mother Jones. You can find my byline and work there. And go ahead and get the book at harpercollins.com/triggerpoints or Google Trigger Points and mass shootings, and you'll find it that way. And I hope people enjoy reading it and get some insight from it.
Yeah. We all need to get educated much better on this and see if we can do more prevention. Thanks, Modest, for tuning in. Go to youtube.com/Chris Voss. Hit the bell notification button. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss. All of our groups on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, all those different places. Order up the book wherever fine books are sold. Trigger Points Inside the Mission to Stop Mass Shootings in America comes out April 5th. 2022. You definitely want to get a hold of that so you can be one of the first ones on your block to read it. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to be good to each other, stay safe, and we'll see you guys